The Battle of Milne Bay, from August 25 through to September 7, 1942, was the defence of eastern New Guinea by Australian and US forces against a Japanese invasion. It would become the first time that Japanese forces had been defeated on land, shattering the myth at the time of Japanese invincibility. The Royal Australian Air Force played a particularly important role in this battle, maintaining air superiority over the region and inflicting serious damage to invading forces. Milne Bay is a large, wide and deep bay at the eastern tip of Papua New Guinea, where the Australians, in 1942, were building several airstrips for a strategically important defence outpost. The Japanese, having a strong foothold in the Pacific region by December 1941, aimed to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea. However, strong US and Australian forces in the Coral Sea prevented the capture, which would have been an ideal corridor for Japanese forces to invade northern Australia. The Japanese realised the Allied base at Milne Bay was a major obstacle to Japanese plans to advance on Port Moresby. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake made a plan for the Japanese 8th Fleet to capture the new Allied base at Milne Bay. However, the Milne Bay invasion plan was put on hold after the American landings at Guadalcanal on the 7th of August. The fortification of Milne Bay started in June 1942, when the first troops and engineers arrived from Port Moresby. They quickly started building the infrastructure needed to support the defence, including several airstrips. The first troops arrived at Milne Bay from Port Moresby on the 25th of June 1942, and engineers built No. 1 airstrip and associated taxiways and accommodation, as well as docks and roads. By the end of July, RAAF 76 and 75 squadrons were working out of the operational airstrip.
76 Squadron went in first and 75 went in next, but not very far apart. But the strip had only just been finished in this plantation, bulldozed out of a plantation with this steel matting on it. That was quite exciting. It was quite, when you lobbed on that stuff, and particularly after rain and what have you, you know, the spray would go up, water everywhere. And it was very primitive, those fairly early days in Milne Bay.
We were using a metal strip, and this in itself was the first time that we'd ever seen it, although the Americans had used it frequently in other places, in other islands. But without the strip, they would never have been able to build a strip in Milne Bay, or without the metal strips, I mean, they would never have been able to put in an aerodrome. The ground was so boggy and so wet that the mud the water just oozed up from the mud. But they did lay this matting which is meshed and links into each other, and although the aircraft went up and down as you landed and taxied along it and the water came up through it, eventually it went back to almost being fairly level. It was a bit tricky landing on it and taking off, but it worked. And we even had that mesh down through the parking areas for the aircraft and even leading up to our huts, so that wherever you could, you walked on that mesh. Otherwise you might have been walking in 3 inches or 6 inches of mud and water. But it was very effective, and it certainly saved the day at Milne Bay.
We arrived in Milne Bay, I think, about 10 days before the Japs arrived in Milne Bay. And we all got down there and settled in, and it was back to the mud and slush and tents and whatnot, and awful conditions. Milne Bay, it was a muddy bloody hole. Rained and rained and rained all the time. 76 Squadron, they settled down, we settled down. We were way out in the bush, and that was that. But eventually we did training there, and then I think it was about a week and a half till they started to raid Port Milne Bay, and they raided sort of continually. The weather was in our favour.
On August 4th, Japanese aircraft began to bomb and strafe Milne Bay with 4 Zero fighters accompanied by a reconnaissance aircraft. Attacking the airstrip, the Zeros destroyed one Kittyhawk on the ground. Fortunately, 8 Kittyhawks from 76 Squadron were airborne on patrol at the time. They responded to the attack and shot down the reconnaissance aircraft, the first confirmed kill above Milne Bay.
We were only there a short period of time, and first alarm went off of it. It was a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft being escorted by a couple of Zeros. Came in to see what was going on. 76 Squadron were on patrol at that time. We were keeping standing patrols up all the time then. Anyhow, they shot down the reconnaissance aircraft and thought they also shot down one of the Zeros, but that was not confirmed. So that was that day. Well, from that day on, the alert was on all the time. And there were numerous skirmishes, and between Zeros and Kittyhawks, and between 76 and 75 Squadron, we lost 6 pilots in a matter of a few days there, shot down, including one of my particular mates, Mark Sheldon, also an ex-Windsor boy too, by the way, and who had also learnt to fly at Camden Grove Aero Club when I did in the early days before the war.
Midday on 11th August, a second air raid did not take the Australians by surprise. A dozen Zeros met with 22 Kittyhawks from both RAAF squadrons. By the end of the fight, 3 RAAF pilots were missing, and a fourth, Sergeant George Inkster, crashed and died on Gurney Field. The Kittyhawks being flown by 75 and 76 Squadron were Curtiss P-40Es. Here is what some of the pilots thought of their Kittyhawks.
They flew the early Spitfires, of course, but even the early Kittyhawks, I think they were just as manoeuvrable. They were great. I enjoyed flying Kittyhawks, and I think that they should have got a lot more credit than they did. But the Spitfire boys won't say that. They'll have a different story. But certainly up at height, that was one of the drawbacks to the Kittyhawk. You know, we could get it up to 22, 23,000 feet, the earlier ones. But even at that height, we were starting to waffle in the air. Quite different. Whereas the Spitty could go a lot higher than that.
Can you describe the handling characteristics of the Kittyhawk at that altitude?
Oh, yes. If you wanted to do anything, you had to use, if you like, twice or 3 times as much pressure to make an impression, because nothing, how do you put it, the air gets so thin up there that nothing works on your controls, and you've really got to give her plenty of movement to do anything, and then to correct it, it's the same thing. You go back miles the other way, but you'd squash away a long time before she'd react. Quite difficult when you've got 12 aeroplanes up there.
It was a beautiful aircraft, the Kittyhawk, for strafing, because it had 6.5 cannon. And so from that point of view, it was far more effective than the Spit. The Spit was all right while the cannons worked, but the cannons tended to get a lot of stoppages, and so you were down to 303s. But the Kittyhawk with the .5s was quite a deadly aircraft to strafe with. And we did a great deal of that, particularly on Japanese barges, apart from strafing, of course, the Japanese troops in Milne Bay. But we went to other places, and we caught up sometimes with some of their small craft. And the Kittyhawk was an ideal aircraft. And I think for those conditions, particularly because of the landing on that metal strip, it was a better aircraft perhaps than the Spit. The Spit is much more solid than people give it credit for in the undercarriage, but it wasn't built to land on a strip which floats in and out of mud and water. Sure. So I don't know just how it might have taken.
We flew Kittyhawks, and our first impression of Kittyhawks was not very good. I was telling you how delightful Spitfires were. You got into Kittyhawk, and we described it as a bulldozer. A great big heavy aeroplane, not as nice to fly as any of the others I'd flown, but pretty reliable, hefty and strong, could take a real belting. And thank goodness it could, because after we'd formed up there a little while, we got sent up to Milne Bay with another sister squadron called 76, so I was in 75. And that was one of the worst wars I've ever been to. Russia was a picnic compared to Milne Bay. Milne Bay was bloody awful. Never stopped raining. The mountains come straight up from the strip. The strip was just a mud with steel planking on it, and when you landed it used to do this sort of thing, and mud would fly up, and Spitfires wouldn't have lasted. You couldn't fly a Spitfire, wouldn't last it. But in the end, up in places like Milne Bay and so on, we got to be very fond of it, because for many reasons. First of all, it could go a lot further than the Spitfire could. Secondly, it was far more robust. One of our chaps came back. He'd been shot up by some ground fire somewhere. He had a hole in the fuselage down near the rudder that I could put my head and shoulders through, and he threw it back. Now, a Spitfire, that would have been the end. Anything that big had hit it would have knocked it off. The Kittyhawk had some failings that you could turn into successes. At one stage, this is not during Milne Bay, but the Australians captured a Japanese Zero, their fighter, and so they flew it and worked out combat manoeuvres with their own aircraft. And one of the things we found out that was if you could get above the Japanese fighters and trade off your height for speed, you could peck. You could come down, peck, climb up again, and so on. But whatever you do, don't mix it with them, because they'd turn inside you in a couple of turns and knock you off. The Kittyhawk had not a vice, but a strange thing that in a dive at a very high speed, it wanted to roll one way and yaw the other, which aeroplanes shouldn't do, and it's very uncomfortable in the cockpit. But we found out that if you were bounced by a Jap and you dived full bore, got up over the speed where these things happen, took your hands and feet off, and the aeroplane did manoeuvres that nobody could ever shoot down because it was rolling one way and yawing the other. It would be impossible to shoot.
On the ground, malaria was an enormous problem in the Milne Bay area. The malaria threat was well known long before Allied forces occupied the area. There was an alarming ineffectiveness of preventative measures, primarily because such measures were pushed down the list of priorities. By September, there were 33 infections per 1,000 soldiers per week. Given an army of over 10,000 soldiers at Milne Bay, over 330 soldiers were being treated for malaria each week, and during an epidemic in December, there were 3,000 cases diagnosed.
I liked the tropics, having been there, for a while. But when we first went into Milne Bay, it's a beautiful little spot bay, but rain, very humid, seemed to always rain every day. And we had a lot of initial troubles. The strip had only just been finished. If you slid off the strip, the people would have to try and dig you out of the mud and what have you. But and camping was primitive. We were under tents and quite primitive to what, having been in England and lived in mansions and beds and everything else, and Batman, we got a rude awakening up there. Different kettle of fish altogether. We were in tents, mind you, and we had these camp stretchers. But you had to have mosquito nets. Malaria was very bad in Milne Bay.
We all had malaria and dysentery. I had both at one stage, and just sort of unpleasantly, but I remember and our living conditions were so squalid. We had 6 in a little bloody tent, and a little bit of timber on the floor, but most of it was mud. And I had malaria, and the squadron doc, who I saw the other day, Bill had come in and say, God, I got down to 8 stone 7, would you believe? Anyway, he said, Bill said, hey, don't you get out of that stretcher. I said, couldn't have got out anyway. He'd walk out and the boss would come in and see how I'd come in and say, airborne. So he'd go out and have a little vomit on the tail wheel, get into the cockpit. I'm not exaggerating, this is truly. And you'd get airborne, and you'd go up to wherever it was, do one of these patrols. you'd take your oxygen mask off and have a vomit all over the place and put it back on again. You'd have diarrhoea and it'd be seeping down the back of your legs into your flying boots. You had another hour and a half to sit up there and all this.
By early August, the 55th Infantry Battalion had become so badly afflicted by malaria and other tropical diseases that they were sent back to Port Moresby. Major General Cyril Clowes was appointed to command Milne Force, which was placed under the control of New Guinea Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell. By the end of August, about 600 RAAF personnel occupied Milne Bay, with around 4,500 infantry, and just as many other personnel from Australia and the US. The Japanese had completely underestimated the size of this Allied force. However, the Allies had superior intelligence about Japanese plans, size of attacking forces, and which units and ships were allocated for the assault. On 23rd and 24th of August, Japanese aircraft carried out pre-invasion bombing around the airfield at Rabi. The main Japanese invasion force left Rabaul on 24th of August, made up of 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, 2 transports, and 2 submarine chasers. At 8:30 a.m. on the 24th of August, Milne Bay General Headquarters was alerted by a RAAF Hudson bomber near Kitava Island, off the Trobriand Islands, and coast watchers that a Japanese convoy was approaching the Milne Bay area. Reports of the second Japanese convoy, consisting of 7 barges sailing from Buna, was also received. The RAAF could not intercept the barges at that time, as Milne Bay itself was under air attack, and it would be the next day, at midday, that 2 flights from 75 Squadron would go out to investigate. The barges were spotted beaching at WWII Bay on the southwest tip of Goodenough Island, where the 350 troops had gone ashore to rest.
We were dispatched to go in the bad weather to fly over sort of north or west by north to Goodenough Island, because the coast watchers had, I said there was about 8 or 9 or 10 barges were coming down the coast loaded with troops and whatnot, and were sort of going down our way towards Milne Bay, and I think there's 8 of us took off from 75 Squadron, and like two flights of 4, and Jeff Atherton was leading ours, and Johnny Piper was leading the other one, but we flew it. The weather wasn't very good, but we flew through to, the way we flew from Milne Bay was across in a northwesterly direction, and we arrived, got on over to Goodenough Island, and we just got there just in time to see the barges just getting ready to pull in onto Goodenough Island, and we immediately, 4 went in and strafed and did untold damage on the barges and whatnot, and we used up all our ammunition on that, and the other 4 that were top cover, they came in after us, and they did the same, and the end result from that, as we heard later, was that nobody got off the island. They were marooned on the island, and we flew back the same way as we went, and those barges and troops were supposed to, coming from Goodenough Island, would have hit the mainland and come in across the back door into Milne Bay, and would have met up with the others coming in through the front door. After we got back, after strafing the barges, 75 Squadron and 76 Squadron took off in the afternoon and appalling weather, and went out flying east to meet the oncoming invasion force, and they with in and out of bad weather, they did sight the convoy coming in, and they bombed and damaged a corvette, I believe, or one of their destroyers, and but they didn't do much damage. There was some 36 Squadron, or 32 Squadron, I think it was, Hudsons. They were trying to bomb them and whatnot, but they finished up getting back, landing back at Moresby late in the evening when it was dark, and tragically a pilot that shouldn't have been there, he'd ferried an aircraft up to replace the aircraft, and he talked somebody into saying could he go out on this trip. And when he came into land, he landed on the wrong side of the flare path and hit the trees and got killed.
This successful attack on the Japanese barges at Goodenough Island was a decisive blow to the Japanese, and certainly dampened the ensuing invasion of Milne Bay. The main invasion force, a heavy naval screening force and 2 transports, were not seen until the next morning of the 25th. US B-17s operating from bases at Moresby and Charters Towers in Queensland were to intercept the Japanese force, but bad weather prevented them. Later that afternoon, a number of Kittyhawks and a single Hudson bomber strafed the convoy and attempted to bomb the transports near Rabi Island. Only limited damage was caused to the convoy and no ships were sunk.
They have first picked up the convoy coming in, and that's when we went out with bombs to try and bomb it, or bomb the transports mainly. So it came in with, from memory, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers, but I think there were 4 or 5 troop ships carrying the troops. So we went after the troop ships naturally, but we weren't very successful. They got 1 near miss, I think. The other thing that we had trouble on that one was they weren't found till sort of mid-afternoon, I suppose, and the first fellas went out on the bombing route. Then the weather also, there was huge clouds sitting on top of all this convoy, so we didn't have much room to manoeuvre, clearly. But we could get in and try and drop a bomb, but we couldn't get really the proper angle of attack to drop them properly. So you could only go down and try and strafe the top of the boats and then disappear out, because one does not normally take on a cruiser. That's fatal, or could be.
At around 10:30 p.m, the Japanese main force, consisting of over 1,000 men and 2 Type 95 Hago tanks, had made landfall near Wagga Wagga, on the northern shore of the bay way further east than intended. This error in navigation meant the force was now an extra 3 kilometres further from their objective. Nevertheless, they established a beachhead and pushed west along the north shore of the bay.
Well, the Japs had landed. When we got there, the Japs had already landed. Both the Kittyhawks and the Hudsons, well, the Hudsons had 2 jobs. They were helping the Kittyhawks to strafe the Japanese positions. The Japanese landed on the northern coast of Milne Bay. Fortunately, they made a mistake. They were landed too far away from where they really wanted to land. We know from Japanese intelligence and so on that they wanted to land close to what was to be number 3 airstrip. It was called Turnbull Airstrip. It had all been cleared, but it hadn't been made into a strip. And they wanted to be landing there, and then they wouldn't be too far from the operating strip, which was called Guinea, number 1 strip. It was more to the south of the Turnbull strip. And so they didn't land there. They landed further up along the north coast. So they had more jungle to fight through to get to the Australian bases.
The next day, the Japanese suffered a serious setback when a daylight RAAF raid hammered their base area with Kittyhawks and a Hudson aircraft, accompanied by B-25s, B-26s and B-17s from the US 5th Air Force. Without any Japanese aircraft to be seen, Allied air forces were free to destroy Japanese supplies, barges and pursue escaping ships. The RAAF Kittyhawks obliterated 12 barges, barrels of fuel and other equipment within a 45-minute strafing spree.
I was made duty pilots down in the strip. A duty pilot always stays there, plus a cook and the operations sergeant. He allocates to the aircraft that were serviceable to the pilots again to fly them the next day. And the cook's job is to make a cup of coffee for what it's worth, for when the pilots and the crew get down there morning before dawn. So about 1 o'clock it would have been in the morning of the 26th, between 12:30 and 1:30, let me say, but we'll put it at 1 o'clock. I heard the gunfire start, and obviously it was naval ships, not our gunfire, and they were looking for the airstrip to start off with, but the shells were going right over the top. So I got on the landline, phoned the CO, Les Jackson, and said, the convoy's in the bay, they're shelling us, they're trying to find the strip. And he said, okay, that's all right. He said, get the cook up and the ops sergeant. We'll be down there very shortly and we'll get off the ground just as dawn breaks. So, anyhow, they arrived down and we had our cup of coffee and a talk. And just as it was breaking dawn, about, I think there were 6 of them, flying fortresses went over the top, not very high. They'd been brought in from Moresby in North Queensland, refuelled at Moresby, and then they were coming up. So they attempted to bomb the convoy as it was leaving the bay, which it was. It landed the troops that night, well, the first lot of troops anyhow, leaving the bay. And one fortress just disintegrated. It was a direct hit on it. Disappeared. The others didn't get hit, evidently. And they did drop their bombs. They damaged one transport. So I'm told in the official history. So we then got off as soon as we could, as soon as it was daylight, enough light so as it wasn't dangerous. And we were heading out of the bay and saw the convoy and went over the top, but then turned around and saw where they'd been landing the troops, because there were barges there, motorised barges. So we got stuck into these barges and destroyed them all, except one. I think the army got hold of one, which only had a few holes in it, and they used it afterwards for themselves, the Australian Army. Then we started strafing all the fuel dump that they had established, the stores depot they'd established in amongst the coconut trees, and we set fire to a lot of it and burnt it up and so forth.
Nevertheless, the Japanese maintained pressure on the Australian forces, countering the push west, and planned to advance at night when the Kittyhawks were grounded. That night, Japanese ships came in to shell Australian positions as the Japanese pushed forward. Over the next 2 days of the 27th and 28th, the Japanese force continued to push west toward airstrip number 3 and Gili Gili, inflicting serious casualties to the Australian forces, who had to eventually pull back and establish a defence at airstrip number 3.
So the fighting went on, and arrangements had been made for cooperation between the RAAF Kittyhawk squadrons and the Army for strafing the Japanese ahead of them as the Japanese were advancing, and the Australians were pulling back every now and again, fighting very hard. And it was a terrific arrangement, because when they got right back, we were being told where to strafe by the Army firing what we call Veery pistols, which fire a flare. And if they were landing them about 100 to 150 yards in those days, not metres, ahead of their own troops, of the Australian troops, and that's where we would start strafing. And Japs were in the tops of coconut trees. They used to climb there picking off the Australian troops where they could. We were knocking the tops out of the coconut trees with the 6.5s, and they were falling very heavily.
And they came to us, they came to the squadrons one day and said, we're having trouble, we are losing lives because the Japanese are climbing up in the tops of the coconut trees and the snipers are firing as we advance through the plantations and we can't see them. And we've tried, we can't shoot them, can't do anything. Can you help? So we thought about their problem and we came up with a plan where we would go in 4 aircraft abreast and we would strafe just the tops of the coconut trees. The Army would release a smoke signal and we would not to fire till we'd flown past that smoke signal, and then we would just go 4 abreast, and you couldn't do it for very long because you realise you're going into the trees, so you had to pull out. And then another 4 came in, and both 76 and 75 Squadron did that in 4s for 2 days. It was extremely effective, and they said that after we'd gone past, and when all was quiet, you'd suddenly hear thump and as it was the Japanese falling out of these trees. But we did save lives, fortunately, and it was very difficult country for the army to really to fight in, because the jungle was so thick and so heavy, and these coconut trees gave the perfect hiding place for the Japanese snipers. But we did fix that.
The airstrip proved a perfect defensive location for the Australian forces, offering a wide, clear field of fire, while at its end, thick mud served to hamper the movement of Japanese tanks. The Japanese tanks did indeed get bogged in the mud and were abandoned, and the Japanese were repelled from their advance on the airfield, back 2 kilometres from where they had come. Strafing and bombing runs from the Air Force also forced the Japanese back into the jungle to take cover.
That same airstrip, by the way, number 3 airstrip, because it had been cleared, it was a marvellous defensive position, and in a sense that's what helped, or 2 things helped to defeat the Japanese. The Japanese had landed 2 tanks, and they were making progress until I think they get something like 15 inches of rain, tropical rain one night, and the tanks got bogged, and the AIF were able to sneak up on them and throw hand grenades or other ordnance into them and stop them. But also, the Japanese did land some reinforcements from the warships that came at night, and they got to the edge of this airstrip, but because it was such a cleared area, and the Allies, the Australians mainly, and some American engineers were given machine guns and so on, and they were all lined up in the coconut trees on the other side of the strip, so they had a clear field of fire, and when the Japanese rushed to get across that strip, they were all shot down, all killed. And that was, in a sense, that and the stopping of the tanks was the turning point. And after that, the AIF pushed the Japanese back, and all the time, whenever we could, the Kittyhawks would be strafing them.
The next 2 days saw a lull in the fighting, and this gave the Australians time to consolidate their defences. However, at around 4:30 p.m. on the 28th, a RAAF patrol spotted a Japanese convoy, consisting of 1 cruiser and 9 destroyers, and subsequently reported this to the Allied headquarters. Believing that further landings were about to occur, Major General Clowes cancelled his plans to begin a counterattack and considered what he should do with the Air Force. Group Captain William Garing, senior RAAF officer in Papua, consulted Clowes, and they decided the 30 Kittyhawks at Guinea should be flown to Port Moresby in case the Japanese should overrun the airfield.
A rumour started that the Japs had broken through the Australian lines, and even this went right to the top, and they were talking about, in fact there was one night where, and I think it mainly was a rumour, in fact what I've read about it since, I'm sure, I know it was a rumour, that there was one night there that the heads of the Milne Bay operation decided that we would fly the aircraft out in case the Japanese got to the strip, you see. So we happened to be there with our Hudson, our crew, and we flew out to Moresby. We took some of the spare Kittyhawk pilots with us, and the Kittyhawks flew out. And we all went up to Moresby for that one night, and then the message came the next day, come back, it's all right. The Japs didn't break through.
I mean, the Japs are coming in and shelling us every night, and they shelled a ship that was in there and sank it this night, and they were shelling us every night. They'd come in and just sort of pump shells into it for all hours of the day and night. And what happened then, the Japs looked like overrunning us, and to save the aircraft, they decided to, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, to evacuate 76 Squadron aircraft with their pilots and those pilots that weren't on aircraft or had aircraft, they flew them out in a Hudson, and the same with 75 Squadron. All the old blokes of 75 Squadron, which was not very happy, they were all given aircraft to fly out, and some of the newer pilots, where they had to fly out in Hudsons, they left around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3:30. But what happened, it was 75 Squadron, they had 2 aircraft that were unserviceable, and Bill Cowie and myself were left there to fly them out when they got them serviceable. I think it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, mine became serviceable, the aircraft, and I flew it out, backed up to Moresby, and I arrived at Moresby just as it was getting dusk. And I parked my aircraft and got in a truck that was there, and it was dark then, as Bill Cowie flew in on his aircraft. It was the only aircraft flying, and he came in, he had nav lights on and whatnot, and they had the flare path out, and we're all sitting in, all those 75 Squadron blokes were sitting in, and the 7 mile strip, it ran from east to west, and the eastern end of it was a bootless inlet, which was an inlet, and on each side of it had high hills on each side of the runway. And Bill Cowie came and he flew from the east up along the strip and did a crosswind leg, which took him sort of flying south, and then flew from west to east to come in and land from the east to the west. But we think he must have put his wheels down in the dark and didn't realise that the nose of the aircraft went down, and as he turned to come round, he flew into the hill, was immediately killed, which was a great tragedy, and it was upset a lot of people.
At 8:15 p.m. on the 29th of August, the Japanese convoy arrived off Wagga Wagga and began landing troops and supplies. At the same time, Japanese ships shelled Allied positions around Gili Gili.
One of our jobs at Milne Bay was to try and find these Japanese warships that used to come in each night to shell the place. And so we'd be particularly looking for them at dusk, when they would be trying to sneak in and get there by the time night fell, and we caught them. And so we went in to bomb them, and the tropical weather was closing in, so we only had a fleeting glimpse of them, and they were firing like anything at us, and we couldn't, there was too much cloud for us to get a good bombing opportunity. So we flew back up into the clouds, and in the clouds, of course, being tropical weather, it was very rough and bumpy, and having to sort of dodge the ack from the warships, we sort of lost our bearings, and and it was difficult to go, particularly knowing that the Japanese ships were going to come in and shell the airstrip and the facilities at Milne Bay. The pilot decided we better go back onto Port Moresby. Navigator, because of all the dodging around and that in the cloud, we couldn't work out just what our position was. So this is one occasion where, again, as I mentioned earlier, we came back home on the radio bearings. We called up the direction finding station at Port Moresby and came in, and it was a rough ride because of the tropical weather, you know, the plane bouncing around and that and so forth and so on. So it's I suppose an example of the difficult situation, particularly trying to work a wireless set when your aircraft is, you know, dodging around and so forth. Yeah, on that same night, it was rather hairy. At one stage, the pilot said, "Oh, look," he said, "we may have to bail out because the engine is dropping revs." So he told us, look, get your parachute harnesses on. And so I forget who was operating in the wireless, either myself or the other way, but we were both in the wireless compartment, which is just behind the pilot and the navigator. And so putting our harness on, unbeknownst to us at first, the generator, which provided the power for the wireless set, was on the floor beside us. And in putting our harness on, one of us must have flicked the fuses. They were on the side of the generator. We flicked the fuses. So when we sat down to work the set, it was dead, you see. Now, you think, oh, everything's going wrong, what's wrong with... And so anyway, we looked around to try and work out the trouble, and then we saw the fuses on the floor. So we put them back in. And by calling up the sort of direction finding station, they knew we were in a bit of trouble. So they arranged with the Army, the searchlight unit, and what they did, they shone a beam straight up in the air from the strip. And so we saw that beam, and the pilot managed to circle the beam and come down and land. It's sort of a half an hour or an hour of a rather fraught situation.
Later in the night of the 30th, the Japanese began forming up for an attack again on No. 3 airstrip. And at 3 a.m. on the 31st of August, they launched their attack. However, the airstrip was heavily defended, and the Japanese were repelled by heavy machine gun and mortar fire. The Japanese withdrew just before dawn, shocked by the heavy firepower the Allied forces had been able to deploy. Early on the 31st, the Australians began what would be a slow and bloody counterattack, pushing the Japanese back east along the north shore of Milne Bay. During the early morning of the 6th of September, 933 of the surviving Japanese were evacuated by ship at 3 a.m, with an unknown number of survivors left on the battleground. The day before, on the 5th, 6 Beauforts of No. 100 Squadron had arrived at Milne Bay, to be followed by an additional 3 Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron on the 6th. The Beauforts were tasked with providing additional support against further landings and anti-shipping strikes. The bombers were a welcome addition to the theatre at Milne Bay, as shipping attacks in the bay were still a serious threat. For example, just after 10 p.m. on the evening of the Japanese evacuation, the freighter Anshun, unloading cargo at Gili Gili, came under fire from the Japanese cruiser Tenryu and the destroyer Arashi, with Anshun receiving about 10 hits from the cruiser and rolling onto her side at the docks. Wagga Wagga was also shelled as the Japanese troop evacuation operation was underway. The next night, 2 Japanese warships, a cruiser and a destroyer, bombarded Australian positions, causing several casualties for 15 minutes before leaving the bay. But for the most part, the battle at Milne Bay was over, and a remarkable victory for the Allies.
And because of the defeat of the Japanese were defeated there by the Australian Army and the Kittyhawks for that matter, who played their important part there. General Slim from over in the Far East, the Commander-in-Chief, addressed his troops either directly or by telex, saying the Australians have proven that the Japanese are not invincible, because that is the first invasion force, regardless of how big or how small it was, that had ever been defeated, a Japanese invasion force that had ever been defeated during World War II. And that opened everybody's eyes.